These are remarkable times for our industry that has not escaped any of you in this room. Back in the US, some newspapers are vanishing. Print circulation is on decline for many newspapers. Once trusted sources are being substituted or certainly challenged by new voices out there. We heard many of them already at this conference. And disruptive technologies are overhauling one industry after another, and media not being the last, but also not being the least impacted. These are also remarkable times because, in my view, they're fantastic times. More people have access to more information than ever before, in more places than ever before, and faster than ever before. And some of the things that we have talked about for years or even decades in terms of technology and access to news are actually happening right now. It's a time of great steps forward, I think, for our industry. And I think probably it's the most exciting time to be in media, certainly during the 20 years that I've been part of the profession. My name is Almar Latour, Editor-in-Chief for Asia for the Wall Street Journal Print and Digital, and previously Managing Editor for the Wall Street Journal Online. We will discuss today sustainable models for journalism in the future. Let me introduce you to the panel, which is short, one person. Right next to me, Josh Benton from Harvard's Nieman Journalism Lab. Flanking him is Reg Chua, my former colleague at the Wall Street Journal, now Editor-in-Chief of the South China Morning Post. And all the way at the end, Tom Crampton from Ogilvy, 360. Let's get started. Let's first identify what the problem and challenge is for the media right now before we start talking about musing about new models, because in order to come up with a solution, we first have to identify the problem. I would be tempted to turn to old media and Reg first, but I won't. I'll start with Josh.
I was old media until quite recently, but now I'm new media, I suppose.
There you go.
I think it's useful to think about the problems in defining the problem as being twofold. One, there's the potential problem on the consumer end. There being a time in which there's not enough news that for us to consume. I think despite the cries of many people who are in the journalism industry, that is, for the most part, a theoretical future. Rather than a present, at least in the United States. I don't know of anyone in the United States who thinks, man, there's just not enough stuff to read anymore. There are specific areas where that is increasingly the case, though, and it's the areas that I think we are most worried about, which would be the coverage of local and state governments and other powerful institutions that may not have a national scope. I don't worry about, say, Washington coverage. I think there are going to be there already are plenty of forces out there looking to dig up dirt on Republicans or Democrats. I think that there's always going to be a marketplace for that kind of information. But I do worry about it at a smaller level, at the local level and the state level, particularly since our newspapers in the United States were radically distributed across the country in terms of their journalistic resources. For a variety of historical reasons, we had one major metropolitan newspaper in most cities that for about 50 years essentially had a license to print money. They could make 20 and 30% profit margins without trying very hard. So that's on the consumer end. I think there is a very real crisis on the producer end, aka working journalists. Since 2006, about 1/3 of all the newsroom jobs in the United States have gone away. That number doesn't really show, it's shown slight signs of not declining quite as much as it has been, but still declining. I think that's going to continue on. And I think that's a very real issue for people who are interested in journalism as a career and as something that they would like to be part of.
Josh, in the huddle before the panel, you mentioned some circulation figures that came in overnight.
Oh yeah, we're just the United States. In the United States, the newspaper circulation numbers come out every 6 months, and they just came out. And the Boston Globe, the newspaper where I live, circulation was down 25% from the year before. Across the nation, I believe it was between 8 and 9% for the average. And that 8-9% decline was viewed as a glorious thing because some people thought it might have been 12 or 14%. It's really a sad period in which people are trying to argue that a slowing in the rate of decline is the same as an increase.
Slowing in the rate of decline. Reg, your perspective.
I didn't realize I was the official dinosaur at the table, but I guess...
Nobody mentioned dinosaur until you just did.
There are many ways to look at the problem. Josh has done a very nice job, I think, talking about it from a consumer point of view. From the journalist point of view, the problem is, we'd like to get paid, and that doesn't happen enough. So just essentially, I think you can break up the problem into several ways if you just look at it from the producer point of view. One is essentially that there's competition. There's competition for readership, for audience, because the barrier to entry has collapsed. Anybody can provide information now. The other problem is there's competition for ad revenue, which in the old days accounted for 80% of U.S. newspapers' revenue and about 70, I think, in Europe, although I'm told that's all collapsed now. So, if you just look at it from a business point of view, the cost and revenue sides don't match up. That's why the costs have been slashed dramatically at a lot of newspapers, and people are trying to do all sorts of different things to either bring down the cost or generate new revenues. But I think that's in many ways the wrong question to ask, and I think that's why Josh has framed it very well. But you have to look at it from the consumer point of view. And from the consumer point of view, whatever your broad, important question is, keeping people informed, democracy, holding institutions accountable, I think we haven't really sort of started to even look at the question of how people want to get information and build products around them. I think one of the fundamental problems that the news industry faces, and we're all guilty, is that we haven't really thought about how to do things in a way that our readers and our consumers, our customers, which is a dirty word in many newspapers, want, as opposed to what we would like to do and how we would like to do it. So I think that that's a debate that needs to get started reasonably soon, or we are all in serious trouble.
Well, let's have a little bit of that debate here. Tom, your perspective on the problem.
First, a little bit of background on myself, just to show the direction with which I'm looking at this. I'm a recovering journalist. I spent many years as a foreign correspondent with the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, and now have switched over entirely to working within social media. The role that I have really is something that, it's not my fault, but I think things are going to get even worse. That is to say, I think that the downturn brought by the financial crisis is hitting publications and the news media to a tremendous extent. I think the internet is hitting publications to a tremendous extent for some of the reasons mentioned here, largely this breaking of this monopoly of distribution that used to exist. But I think a third factor that really hasn't been taken into account enough is the impact, the structural impact that social media is going to have. What has suddenly happened with social media is the ability of a company or a private individual to create an equivalent competitor to a major media organization. The barrier to entry is extremely low. Suddenly, if I am a corporation, I am not going to necessarily want to consider going in through a publication. If I have a media property that I am owning and totally controlling, why deal with the media at all? I could look at advertising in the media as, in fact, a tax, where it's much easier for me to deal directly with the consumers or my potential consumers themselves. A second point I'd raise, first point is it's worse than people might think it is. The second is the good news, and that's a little bit what Almar referred to a little while ago. This is, without doubt, the best time, not in the last 5 years, 20 years, but the best time in the history of humanity to be a storyteller. And fundamentally, that's what I always was as a journalist. I was never worried about the business side. I was always on the expenses side. My job was to go out and spend money and tell stories. And it's never been a better time in the history of the world to do that. Now you are empowered with tools which are absolutely free to you to create a website which can compete with these people who had a monopoly on storytelling before, who were the world's largest publishers. What that does not take into account is, I think, really one of the things that many of us here on the panel are concerned about, and it's one thing that I think is fundamental to the future of open society, and that is how we are going to support those parts of journalism that are extremely expensive, difficult to do, generally are only done by people who are focused on doing that, and that's holding powers to account. It's writing stories that take a long time to do and take a great deal of energy and, frankly, money to do. How are we going to find the resources to fund the kind of journalism that is necessary for the kind of society that I would like to live in?
Okay, well, thanks. I was going to turn to Anurag Batra, who still isn't here. I'm going to officially yield his seat to the iPad. So.
Symbolic.
So,
you don't want to buy him now. You want to wait a year. He'll have another better.
Anurag 2.0.
That's you crossed the border there. So speaking of Tom's storytelling, I mean there is a fantastic business story out there, and it's paid versus free. It's just one of the better business stories you could imagine. Tom, just to start with you, I mean you focused on the storytelling, but obviously even being an expense person or having been an expense person, revenue matters. One of the main challenges for large media companies is the production of news costs a lot of money, yet a lot of news is being given away for free. Is there a solution? Is making everything paid a solution to the problem that exists for them?
I'm going to take this from a sort of different angle.
I suspect that you would.
Which is to say, I'm going to look at this from the point of view of where I came from in journalism, which is the point of view of a reporter, a storyteller. And I would look at this as an opportunity for individuals, and not to talk too much about what I'm talking about social media and journalism this afternoon, but it really is this huge opportunity that if I were a reporter right now, I would seize entirely, because you can disintermediate your employer. Basically, as an individual journalist, you now have an opportunity to create your own brand, your own platform, which paid or free, in terms of that platform itself, I know we're talking about broader media, it brings things that go well beyond paid or free opportunities. It becomes something entirely different, and the role of the journalist becomes something very different, which is more of a curator, somebody interacting. In terms of publications themselves, I think that we're sort of moving in a direction that has two paid models that I find very interesting. One is the Wall Street Journal, another is the Financial Times, and I think that they are arriving at answers. The problem with that is both of those publications have a readership within the business community that is willing to pay good money for them. When you come to a general interest newspaper, that paid versus free debate becomes a little bit more difficult.
Okay, Reg, you have a paid online product.
We do. I mean, just let me go so it doesn't strangle Josh. You know, when it comes to free versus paid, I think the answer is yes. Which is it's like you run a shop and you know, some things you give free, some things you give paid, and people say you could charge more for this. Well, the answer is, well, charge more for it. So if you can, you should, and if you can't, you shouldn't. It's quite simple. We have a nearly completely walled site, although we're experimenting a little bit on the one-click free side of it, which is you know, somewhere between the journal. Actually, it is the journal's model, which is you get some stuff free. The trick is obviously you want to cut back, you want to make sure you don't have a certain amount of cannibalization, you want to make sure you're collecting circulation revenue, and you want traffic all at the same time. And there is not sort of a Goldilocks solution, but there's probably there are ways you can tweak it until you get a little bit of everything. I do think that it is not a deeply useful discussion beyond the can we just get a bit of revenue out of it. I don't think it's an ideological battle as it's become in many cases. Because at the end of the day, circulation revenue is only going to be that much of it. If you don't, and it's useful. News organizations need to have multiple streams of revenue. This is one of them. That's a helpful thing to have. But if you can't do it, it doesn't mean you're wrong. And if you can do it, doesn't mean you're wrong either. I think one thing that is worth noting, and Tom raised it about, essentially you have to have content that people feel is valuable. But I don't think that business news is the only valuable news. You look at ESPN, you look at Sports Illustrated, and what they've done is, it's not so much that, a sports story from ESPN, I'll just stipulate, is not that much better than a sports story from Sports Illustrated. But what they've done is they've built very immersive and engaging applications around it. In both cases, it's fantasy football leagues or fantasy baseball leagues. And so what that means is it sucks you into a universe where you essentially use their news, use their information, and you stay there. Now, does that save the republic? No, it doesn't. But it does give you an idea of what the model should be, I think, which is the sucking of people into immersive environments where they use your information.
But regarding the South China Morning Post, I mean, does the fact that you are paid online, does that contribute to your model being sustainable? Also, 5 years out, is it an essential ingredient for you?
I don't know if it's essential. It certainly gives us a decent revenue stream that is, at this point material to us. Although that, whether that's because, the ad environment was so bad last year is an open question. I think that it's something that we have to experiment around. But I think that for most publications that feel that, I think anyway, that have a high embedded cost of generating news, I think most people have to think about all the ways they can generate revenue, and having a paid site is useful in the sense that it's easier to go from paid to slightly free or partly free than it is to go the other way around. And so that, I think, gives us a certain amount of flexibility that I'm quite happy to have.
Josh?
I agree that there are certain publications that can handle being free, and there are certain that can handle being paid, and that they should each sort themselves out. I think that the vast majority of existing news organizations in the United States, at least, the answer has to be free because no one's going to pay for them. There was a noted example some months ago where Newsday, a very large newspaper, a very storied newspaper on Long Island, decided to put up a paywall. And they had a few other ways to get around the paywall. If you were a subscriber to the local cable service, you could get in for free, or if you subscribe to the print newspaper. But after about 6 months, they had a grand total of 35 online subscribers, which could have, bought lunch for a few members of the staff, perhaps, but that was about it. The vast majority of news organizations in the United States have competitors who are happy to be the free option. If the Boston Globe tomorrow decided that it wanted to charge for its website, the local public radio stations, the local television stations, the other newspaper in town, they would all be happy to be the free alternative. So it's a really difficult it's a difficult shift to make. The areas where it can work are places like the Journal and places like the FT, are other places that offer really specific and preferably business-oriented information. Every month I pay $20 to get a daily email newsletter about the book publishing industry, because I'm interested in the book publishing industry. That's actually more money than I pay than to just about any other news organization. More than I pay the New York Times every month, which is $0, and more than I pay everybody else. And I'm willing to do it because it provides me very specific, very precise information that is immediately useful to me. And that is a test that I just think that most news organizations, traditional news organizations, aren't able to meet. Which is why when you look at the new generation of online startups that have come up, if they are attached to a geography, if they are about covering a particular city, they tend to be either extremely small scale and have the ambitions to have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 reporters if everything goes great, or they are set up as nonprofits and are hoping that the philanthropists and the foundations of the community will support them. The ones who are investing in for-profit online organizations they're almost all related to niche markets that extend over large geographic areas. Something like ESPN can be appealing to someone in Boston and someone in Los Angeles and someone in Shanghai. It's that tie to geography which is particularly problematic, I think.
Okay. Sorry, Reg, do you pay for anything that you read?
No, I don't pay for anything. I don't.
How many people in this room pay for something online that they read?
Thank you.
I applaud you.
10 people.
All right. So if not paid, let's dwell in the free for a while. Within that realm, what are some of the options that media publications have? Josh already mentioned localization. Any great examples of successful hyper-local business models that you see out there for media organizations?
There have been some that have been successful, again, at that very small scale. If you're looking to start a website that will cover a college town vigorously and have a staff of 3, that's doable. There are people doing that. If you're looking to create anything approaching the size of a traditional American newspaper newsroom, then there really aren't any models that have evolved up to this point. But you do see, I think the direction that newspapers tend to be going, the smart ones, the next thing that they're trying at least, is trying to recreate their relationship with advertisers to serve a few purposes. One, to be a better conduit between advertisers and the internet, which is often a world that they don't quite understand. Being a media buyer for them to sort of take a more active marketing role in pulling advertisers into that world, more so than they might have in the past. You also see organizations trying to create advertising deals that are tied to specific transactions, saying like, you want to sell boats, I'm going to make sure that you sell 10 boats, but I'm going to get 5% of all your boat sales that come through my news organization, and creating a media advertising strategy that is directly tied to the transaction. You see that some efforts in that direction, but it's really tough. The sad reality is that most of the paywall discussions that we're having in the United States right now tend to be not so much about creating new streams of revenue, because even the most optimistic newspaper publisher doesn't think that their entire city is suddenly going to want to start paying for a website. What they're really about is protecting the bleeding of the print product and trying to maintain those print subscribers as long as they can, because after all this transition, print newspapers are still pretty darn profitable. So in a lot of ways, it's about maintaining the value of the print product as long as they can, but hoping they can figure out something along the way.
So a defensive play.
Yeah, and if you look at the people who are making the decisions, they tend to be within half a decade of retirement. They're not going to look for a revolution. They're looking for a stepping stone when we're in revolutionary times.
Just let me so if Tom's a recovering journalist, I'm a recovering business journalist, which is even worse. So let me just sort of try and frame this in sort of a extremely bloodless, cold-hearted way, despite the fact that it's like most of the people I'm talking about are my friends and myself, and I'd like to stay employed and paid, which is Josh framed it very well. If you want to have 3 people who aren't paid a lot of money and cover a small town, no problems. You can cover your costs and you can not save for your kids' college, but you'll survive. And you can't scale it because beyond a point, you don't get the ad revenues don't come in. The real problem is that a newsroom or an existing, an old newsroom is built a certain way and has certain costs. The way it's worked right now is we try to take those costs, and now, because of the internet, we're trying to amortize those costs over as many things as possible, because the one way it used to work was the day of publication, your spike in value, you got immediate ad revenue against that, and then it just went to 0 immediately afterwards. The internet came along, we all had archive, and so now the value collapses at kind of this rate as opposed to this rate. What some people have done with the internet, The Guardian, for example, or the BBC, is to say, we're going to take that one-day spike or that slow decline, and we're going to amortize it geographically. So The Guardian is hugely read in the US. I frankly don't know if they make any ad revenue in the US. Last year they lost 100,000 pounds a day. So, good. But I think that one of the questions we haven't asked ourselves is how do you amortize that value over time? Which is really what it is. Because unless all of us want to take drastic pay cuts, and I'm not volunteering, but anybody in the room wants to can, unless you want to take a drastic pay cut, your cost of news production is going to always be a certain level. So if the revenue doesn't come in at that level, the question is, then how do you find the chunks of revenue that will make it up? And my feeling is that the only way we can really get some of those chunks back is by learning how to make that thing useful over time and not just in archive, because to be honest, we do a terrible job selling archive.
Just on cost, I mean, are the costs of producing news out of whack with the revenues that we get for them, and does the cost side need to be addressed? In that, I just ahead of this debate on one of the people in the audience on Twitter was saying online journalists make a lot less than print journalists. If that gets somehow adjusted, is it a more sustainable model? You run both print and online.
I feel like a. Why don't you just bring the big, spotlight and put it on me while I sweat? I don't think. Could everybody make less money? Yes, everybody could make less money. That's probably not what we want. I mean, I think that it's got to be addressed on both sides. There are structural issues in newsrooms that are built a certain way. They do things a certain way, and there are, in effect, then they're not efficient, okay, in the worst possible business speak kind of way. At the same time, I'd say we're not efficient about getting revenue. As I say, we don't sell archive very well. But I think that it isn't simply, we squeeze journalists and we squeeze advertisers or subscribers and we'll pull it nearly, we'll be okay. I think we just need to rethink what it is we make and how we make it. Tom knows this because we were both on a panel at some point, and I said there's 5 questions that we need to ask when a disruptive technology like the internet comes along. We have asked 3 of them to death. We're starting to ask the 4th, and we haven't really begun to ask the 5th. And the questions are, what happens to revenue? Okay, so we've just been talking about this, and we debate this one to death. Free versus paid, all that. We ask ourselves, how does it change the way we can tell a story? And we've done huge amounts on that. Graphics, animation, wonderful stuff that provides much higher value, the iPad being a good example. We talk about, from a newsroom, how does it help our reporting tools? And we have all sorts of new things, crowdsourcing, computer-assisted reporting, databases, all of that, great stuff. We've started to ask, but we haven't really asked, how do we restructure the newsroom to really start changing things? If you walked into your average newsroom and you got rid of the computers and you just looked at the workflow, it wouldn't be very different in many cases from a 1950s newsroom. It's still that the factory floor hasn't changed. And then finally, we have not at all really begun to ask ourselves, what is the product we make? And why is the product we make not changed for a new age? The best, simplest example I can have is if you go into if we write a story like people are going to read it tomorrow or 5 minutes from now, if you go into any archive and you say, I want to find this great story that was written 6 months ago, and so you find it, even though we all know search engines are not perfect. But let's say you find the right story or the 5 stories. You go, you read it, and halfway in the story it says, next week, the government will decide this. When was next week? Next week was, and you scroll to the top story. Oh, that was June 12th last year. Next week is, June, whatever. We don't, this is the easiest thing to fix. We don't begin to try to make our product good enough for our readers, and we should start doing things like that.
Josh.
I think there's actually an interesting analog to that. Who has heard of Demand Media? This very, very talked about company in the United States these days. It's basically a company it's been called a content mill. Basically what they do is every day they create somewhere on the order of 5,000 stories or videos or pieces of content, as they call them. And they are all based around predicting what people will be searching for. So they'll answer questions like, what are 10 things I should know about how to buy a kayak? And that will be one of the things that they will write a story about. And they'll do this based on on algorithms and data they have drawn from search engine results. And as a result, they're able to say, well, if I pay a freelancer $25 to write this very short article, I can expect that over the next several months, I will get this many search results going to this page, there will be this much advertising against it, and they're able to extrapolate the revenue that they will earn off this piece of content over a period of weeks and months, and to give it some life that goes beyond tomorrow. Now, demand media is deeply offensive in any number of ways to the traditional journalistic ethos, and it doesn't really address anything beyond the so-called soft sections of the newspaper. It's very feature-oriented, it's very how-to-oriented. But nonetheless, they are thinking not in terms of what's going to be happening, what we're going to be publishing tomorrow or in 5 minutes. They are thinking of, we're going to create content that has lasting value. And I agree, that's one thing that newsrooms need to do a lot more of. They can do it in hopefully more socially valuable ways than demand media might do it, but they're asking the right question, I think.
Is specialization in a certain topic, is that a sustainable path forward? And that you cater to a narrow group of readers or viewers who might be willing to pay for all I know?
Well, I think niche is a very, verticals are a very powerful thing, because somebody wants to, when you're on the internet, you're searching for something very specific, you want to delve in very deeply in it, and you'd be willing to even pay for that, pay $20 a month for a publishing newsletter. So I think niche is a very important thing. I think further to the difficulties ahead, I think it's useful to look at news in a little bit like music and the music industry. Music has now become a loss leader. Is that the direction that news and information are coming? Nokia will give away music on their phones in order for you to buy it. That's one direction that news can go. In terms of the sustainable models, for me, there's with a media company, they really need to examine sort of 3 legs of a stool for sustainability, and that's, I think there is a future for print. I think print has a role in many ways. The other one is online. You have to have the correct sort of approach to online and interacting with people. And the third one is in person, and this is something that I think many media companies are only starting to explore. And these are the 3 pillars for what I think is, for what is one of the most profitable parts of the media industry, not general interest newspapers, but back to the niche issue, business-to-business media. They really build communities online. They have print publications which add value, and they have gatherings. Each one of these might be done for free in one situation, or they might be paid for in one situation, and they could be paid for to a huge amount. You would pay $1,000 to have an hour with a journalist who is a specialist on this one thing. On the other hand, you might have a gathering which takes place for free. So for me, those are online, in person, and in print are the 3 fundamentals that every media company should be examining.
Okay, let me add to that too, which I agree 100%. You are looking at all these different revenue streams, if you like, and different things you can do. And niche, I think, maybe the word isn't niche, but focus. I think focus is where you bring value, because you are adding something every day to a continuing pool of knowledge that your journalists or journalists are creating. I think that when we the word newspaper, everybody's gotten over the word paper. We've all gotten rid of the word paper. I think we should get rid of the word news as well, because news locks us into a mindset. And every time you hear this debate about news as a commodity, you can't, if Michael Jackson is dead, everybody reports it. And the trouble is, to some extent, news is a commodity. But when we talk about news and newspapers, we talk about what happened 5 minutes ago. We don't talk about the embedded value in all the things that we have created so far. And so if you have been reporting on road safety in your town, and you're writing a story today about a horrendous car crash, really the embedded value, if you have structured your reporting correctly and you've taken it and put it in a proper database, is to know where all the car crashes have happened. And at some point when your readers can go in and surf and say, gee, there's a lot of car crashes at that, on that corner, or for that matter, there's not a lot of car crashes, but every time it rains, there's a lot of car crashes on that site. And that means that your reporters have to know how to report and collect information in a certain way, build out a database. That, to me, is if you like, not news. Everybody wants to know about the car crash, but you're giving the value of all the stuff that you're collecting. But you can only do it if you've restructured your newsroom process to the point where you're collecting it in a useful way that can be fed back out.
So are you reorganizing your newsroom that way?
Oh, well, let's not go ask questions like that.
God forbid I'll act like a journalist. If you couple specialization, which essentially is what Reg is talking about, structuring your journalism to enable very narrow searches, for example, with organization, what kind of organization do you end up with for both old media, new media? Josh, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you end up with many more organizations that are a lot smaller. So it's a much deeper ecosystem of organizations. I think there are going to be a few large winners that stick around and are able to maintain the superstructure of a New York Times, of a Wall Street Journal, but they're going to be the exception as opposed to the rule. I mean, to touch on the point that you were just making, I think one of the most striking statistics I've seen in the last few months was a set of data looking at the average time on site spent by users of American newspaper websites. And it varied from newspaper to newspaper, but it was somewhere between 2 and 8 minutes per month per user. That's the amount of time that the average user of, say, the Boston Globe's website was spending on that website. The highest ranking was the New York Times, which was 20 minutes per month per user. In contrast, the average for Facebook was 7 hours per month. And I think that gets to the issue that I was just at a conference in Texas last week where someone, I forget who it was, said, you never hear anyone say, man, I just got lost on that newspaper website. You know, like I went to WSJ.com and I looked up, it was 6 hours later. I was just so immersed in the beauty of the website. You don't hear that in the way that you hear with other, you hear that about YouTube. You don't hear that about the Wall Street Journal or any other newspaper for that matter. And yes, well, and one of the difficulties there is you're not creating, that's a result of creating content that is meant to be, done and fish wrap in a few hours. It's very much a signal of the old model, and until you're able to create experiences that people want to just live in for a while, it's going to be really hard.
Yeah, time spent on WSJ.com is actually pretty decent, not 6 hours. All right.
But I think it is an interesting point that how many times have we seen a new platform or new approach come out of traditional media organizations? Could the Huffington Post have been created by a traditional media organization or not? By its very nature, does it have to come in as a disruptor, upsetting the status quo, rather than being created internally?
Yeah.
So you think there's a chance to create more of those internally, you think? Or
no, I'm saying that it's apparently it's very difficult for traditional media organizations to innovate in that way. Mm-hmm. So many of these platforms come in as startups, something on the outside, which is becomes wildly popular, then people take a notice, and then the traditional media organizations will begin taking on some of those characteristics.
It's particularly difficult when news organizations have defined the way that they've always done things as almost a religion, that they have to maintain the way that things have always been. And that stood journalism that was wonderful for many years, but it really leaves them uniquely poorly positioned to adjust and to be agile in this sort of environment.
But some of them, Josh, you raised an issue a little while ago, which is revenue through transactions. Some of these new business models actually pose ethical dilemmas to the journalism model itself and how you're going to work that forward. The Washington Post had their salons, which was a failure, but in some ways I think that if it done in the right way, maybe there is something that could work that way. The salons were basically where people would have access to the journalists and discuss some of the issues in Washington. So I think that in this experimentation, there's obviously going to be mistakes and issues and problems, but it has to take place. If there's not innovation and if there's not mistakes being made, then I'm more worried for traditional media than not.
Thanks. Plenty of ground left uncovered. Questions from the audience.
So I work for the Boston Globe, and I've appreciated you picking up my organization so well.
It's a lovely newspaper. I mean, lots of people there.
Are you one of the subscribers canceled? I was just wondering if you could, for the Globe, but also for these general news outlets, I mean, what are we doing wrong still, and both from a business side but an editorial side, and what could we be doing better?
Your job in 2 minutes, fix the Boston Globe, fix all general media.
Gosh, I think that the Globe has done a number of things well. I mean, the Globe produces the most widely read regional newspaper website in the United States. It's for the most part a pretty good website. I worry whenever I hear paywall rumors coming out of the business side of the operation, because I don't think that's a story that ends well. I don't know. I mean, part of the difficulty is that I really, as much as I hate to say this, I think that I used to work at the Dallas Morning News, which is sort of a comparable newspaper in terms of its size and its ambitions and its regional nature. And I just don't know what the Dallas Morning News could do to still be the size it was 10 years ago. I don't think that those decisions were there to be made. I think, though, that the Globe has done a good job of investing on the online side, and you know, the Globe has made efforts to do what I think a lot of people think is very smart, which is raise the prices that you charge print subscribers until they can barely take it anymore. Because you'll find that the people who are left as subscribers are the ones who really want to read the newspaper. And what's interesting is that, remember I mentioned before that the Boston Globe circulation was down 25%. Over that same time period, its circulation revenue was actually up by about 3 or 4%, because they raised the prices so much that the people who are left are paying the full freight now.
I think you're really onto something, because I think that on the weekend I would pay much more for a weekend Financial Times than they charge me. I think my pain threshold for buying a weekend Financial Times is probably 3 or 4 times what they charge.
What I've said in a previous time I was speaking at the Globe, I said if I had a vision for what the Globe's going to look like in 10 years, I think it'll come out twice a week, maybe 3 times a week at the most. It'll be on glossy stock and look a lot more like a nice magazine, and it might be $10. And it'll have 1/5 the subscribers it has today, but they'll be paying enough money, and there will be enough of a lead audience that advertisers will want to reach them, and the content will be good enough, and they'll have the website for breaking news during the week. But I think you're going to see increased segregation of the content from print and the web, because they are really different experiences, and it's part of the problem that news organizations have had, is trying to shovel the same kind of material into both worlds.
If I can continue on the Boston Globe, I think that the model would not be 3 times a week or 2 times a week. I think it would be 2 times a week, $10, and then free the rest of the week in some easy distribution model through the methods of some of the city papers.
Tom, Reg, Josh, iPad, thanks very much. Okay.